Hello again, it's Mr. Weed, and we're looking at chapters 6 through 10 now in Tuck Everlasting. And we're going to start with chapters 6 and 7. And we start with those two chapters with two questions each. And again, things that you're going to want to be writing down in your notes. I'll try to tell you, hey, you might want to write this down as we go through. So in chapter 6, I would say that we're going to call that the Winnie is kidnapped chapter. Because after chapter 5, when Ma says, well, the worst has finally happened at last, that someone, Winnie in this case, has discovered this fountain that's coming out of the ground that Jesse was drinking from. And that's what's terrible that's happened. So now they grab Winnie and they get her on the horse and they take off. And of course, Winnie talks about in the chapter, if we look at it, and here in chapter 6, if we look right through here, let me find it. And if you see my cursor here, it's right near the beginning. Winnie had often been haunted by visions of what it would like to be kidnapped. I think that's something that we could all relate to. Who wouldn't want to be kidnapped? But as the chapter wears on, we again find out that this isn't a character that's just a surface level kid who's going to be screaming and crying and nothing else. She's obviously going to be upset, but there's something about the Tucks that puts her a little bit at ease. And as the chapter wears on, and especially when she gets to see this little musical box that was making the music from the night before that May Tuck shows her, then it calms her down. And when we get to the end of chapter 6, and I'm just going to click right here, we get to the end of chapter 6, the Tucks are trying to get Winnie to understand something. And it says right here, "Look here, Winnie Foster," said Jesse. "We're friends, we really are. But you've got to help us. Come, sit down, and we'll try to tell you why." And that's really key because one of the questions that I wanted you to consider was the second one on my sheet here. How does Winnie feel? You know, obviously she'd be a little bit upset, but there's something that's putting her a bit at ease about that. The other key thing in chapter 6 that we can't forget is when they were leaving, did anyone see them leave with Winnie? And of course, if you remember from what we read, there is one person who saw it. That's right, the man in the yellow suit. And that's going to play a role, as we all know. Now, when we get into chapter 7, this is what I would call the wheel stops for the Tucks. So when we think about our theme and the Ferris wheel of life that you're moving around on, at this point, we find out how it is that they have not changed in 87 years. And the first question, how does it happen? Simply enough, they're getting a drink of water in the woods on the trip, and they don't think much of it until some time passes. And then, how do they know? Well, there's a couple of key things that you can look into the PDF for. And again, chapter 7 starts on this page and goes on to the next. But there are a couple of instances, but one thing in particular, they had a cat, and the cat was the only one that didn't drink the water, and the cat died after a time. Everybody else, including their horse who drank the water, things haven't changed. And they had examples of how, even though they should have died, they didn't. And you can go back and take a look at that. But that's the quick recap on chapters 6 and 7. Chapters 8 and 9, we're going to have a closer look at a couple sections of the text. And in chapter 8, which I call Winnie's reaction, because this is the chapter after she's heard the tale of them drinking the water, and then after many years, the Tuck family realizing that whatever was in that fountain, and that water fountain, has made them stop aging. It is theoretically the fountain of youth, where they are going to be frozen in time at that point. And so the chapter starts, if you look right here, Winnie, look with my cursor, Winnie did not believe in fairy tales. But I want to look at another section where, again, we're looking at the character of Winnie and how she's developing. The Tucks have made it clear they want her to understand she can't tell anybody. There's nobody else that can know about this because they think it'd be bad if other people found out. And so right here at the top of this page, as my cursor says, and I'm going to read from the book, all three of them looked at her hopefully. And Winnie answers here about whether she'll wait until tomorrow to go home. "All right," said Winnie. For she decided there wasn't any choice. She would have to go. They would probably make her go anyway, no matter what she did, but she felt there was nothing to be afraid of. Not really. For they seemed gentle and in a strange way, childlike. They made her feel old. And the way they spoke to her, the way they looked at her, made her feel special, important. It was a warm, spreading feeling, entirely new. She liked it, and in spite of their story, she liked them too, especially Jessie. And this has given us some real insight into Winnie's character. This 10-year-old girl who's off on, in a way, her first adventure. Unwillingly, obviously, she's been kidnapped, but seems to be by benevolent kidnappers who are trying to get her to understand and don't wish her harm. And so that seems to be what's happening. Now, when we look, there is an important thing that happens, though, that we need to remember. And that is at the very end of the chapter. Okay? And let me take a look here. Right down here. They talk about what's going on, and they've told the story and so forth. But it says they didn't notice much in these last few lines here, nor did they notice that he, the man in the yellow suit, was following now beside the road far behind, his mouth above the thin gray beard turned ever so slightly towards a smile. And I probably should have started one sentence sooner where it says, the story was so good, in fact, that not one of them noticed that the man they had passed on the road, the man in the yellow suit, had crept up to the bushes by the stream and heard it all, the whole fantastic story. So whatever that man was looking for when he came to the gate of the Foster house, he now has a lot of information. Whether he was looking for that or not, he has information about the stream. So it's not just Winnie who knows, it's the man in the yellow suit. And that is going to become a key piece in our puzzle as the plot thickens, as they say, and continues along our story. Now, chapter 9 is what I would call Tuck's present. And Tuck's present is the arrival back home of his family, obviously. But you can go back and take a look. I will forward this. We start at the very bottom of that page. That's that right-hand page, chapter 9. Chapter 9 continues onto this page. And near the end, you can follow along right here as Tuck says to Winnie, "How do, Winnie Foster?" said Tuck, shaking Winnie's hand rather solemnly. "Well then," he straightened and peered down at her, and Winnie, looking back into his face, saw an expression there that made her feel like an unexpected present, wrapped in pretty paper and tied with ribbons in spite of May's blue hat, which still enveloped her head. "Well then," Tuck repeated, "seeing you know, I'll go on and say this is the finest thing that's happened in, at least 80 years. And that is the beginning of learning about Tuck, which we'll spend a little more time talking about here in Chapter 10. Chapter 10, we've arrived at the Tuck household. Winnie has met Tuck, and she's this present that he is greatest thing he's gotten in 80 years is this lovely little girl who now knows their secret, and he needs to talk to her about it. But she notices the disorder of the Tuck household. Things seem to be all over the place with projects started and not stopped. And whether or not the author is trying to tell us something about what's important in life and what's not, you can read into that. But I do want to read into the passage that you see outlined in blue. Because again, we're looking for how does this relate to our theme, that wheel that was back in the prologue at the start. And so I'm going to read, and you can read along with me, this passage right here that starts with the blue, where they're talking about what the boys have to do and how they constantly are moving around and so forth. And it starts right when May and Winnie are talking, and May says, "When we need things, we sometimes go to one, sometimes the next," meaning store, so people don't come to notice as much. "And we sell where we can, but I guess we'll be moving on one of these days. It's just about time." Because remember, they've been there about 20 years. It sounded rather sad to Winnie, never to belong anywhere. "That's too bad," she said, glancing shyly at May. "Always moving around and never having any friends or anything?" But May shrugged off this observation. And this is the key point. Let me get a sip of water before I cough here. All right, thanks. This is the key point. "Tuck and me, we got each other," she said, "and that's a lot. The boys now, they go their separate ways. They're some different, don't always get on too good, but they come home whenever the spirit moves, and every 10 years, first week of August, they meet at the spring and come together so as we can be a family again, for a little while. That's why we was here this morning. Oh, look at that. One way or another, it all works out." She folded her arms and nodded more to herself than to Winnie. "Life's got to be lived. No matter how long or short, she said calmly, "You've got to take what comes. We just go along like everybody else, one day at a time." Funny, we don't feel no different. Leastways, I don't. Sometimes I forget about what's happened to us. Forget it altogether. And then sometimes it comes over me and I wonder why it happened to us. We're plain as salt, us Tucks. We don't deserve no blessings, if it is a blessing. And likewise, I don't see how we deserve to be cursed, if it's a curse. Still, there's no use trying to figure out why things fall the way they do. Things just are, and fussing don't bring changes. And this is a key thing to consider, and that is, would that be a blessing or a curse? And I'd like you to think about that as we finish this section on chapters 6 through 10. Would it be a blessing or a curse to have everlasting life, to be everlasting for yourself? Is that what you really want, so that all the people that you know and love continue to move on? Obviously, the Tuck family has the family, but that is it. And there are consequences of not moving on. People thinking that they're witches, for instance, and not being able to get married because your spouse is going to grow old and you're still stuck at that certain spot. It's something to think about, and it's a big idea, I know, for you guys in the 6th grade to consider, but it's one I want you to think about and be able to write on in your Google Classroom as we get to the point where we're done with now the first 10 chapters, at least reviewing them, and we're moving into the next portion of the book, some of which I will read out loud completely to you, so that if you missed some of it and you'd like some help reading along, you can do so. And then we will be reading together new stuff as time wears on here. So good to see you. Can't wait to see you live remotely anyway. And Mr. Weed signing off from Tuck Everlasting.